calling Justin Hunt.
Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, everybody. This is Jesse Weber, and you are watching the prosecution's closing arguments in the Todd Kenhammer case out of Wisconsin. As we keep saying, the verdict was reached last night, and Mr. Kenhammer was found guilty of intentional first-degree homicide in the death of his wife, Barbara Kenhammer. A jury of 10 women, 2 men, found that he did, in fact, murder Barb and concealed it as a car accident. So we're going to continue talking about that case and covering it as well. But we do have a day filled with special segments. We talked about a little bit earlier about Uber. We're going to talk a little bit later about sexual harassment and terrible stories in the restaurant and entertainment industry. We'll focus on that in a little bit. But right now, I want to focus on Roy Moore. Now, Mr. Moore, the problem here for Mr. Moore and these other media outlets is that not only did he lose the Alabama Senate race, but his troubles might not end here. Attorney Gloria Allred suggested that she wasn't quite done with Roy Moore or anyone else, meaning certain media outlets, who cast doubt on the sexual assault claims made by her client, Beverly Young Nelson. Again, this is a woman who has said that Mr. Moore had sexually assaulted her. We're going to talk about that. But really, the best person to talk to me about this case and what this all means is attorney and editor here at lawandcrime.com, Colin Kalmbacher. Colin, great to see you.
Hey, great to see you, Jesse. How's it going?
Great, great. Now, Colin, you wrote a terrific article about what's going on here and the fact that Mr. Moore's troubles might not end here, but he might be facing a potential defamation suit. And not only him, but other news outlets, including Fox News, Breitbart, and the Gateway Pundit. If you can you explain a little bit what's going on here?
Okay, just to give the very basics of it, Roy Moore issued a tweet right after Gloria Allred and Beverly Young Nelson had their, I guess you could say, clarifying press conference, which is kind of how basically all media sold that press conference. The point of that press conference initially, or well, I should say, the Good Morning America appearance immediately prior to that press conference was to verify Moore's signature with the handwriting expert. During the course of that Good Morning America appearance and the clarifying press conference, Beverly Young Nelson admitted to adding notes to the bottom so that she could remember exactly what had happened on the day and the date, I should say, and the location. So the location of the restaurant and the date that Moore allegedly approached her. So immediately after that, Fox News, the Gateway Pundit, and Breitbart, they run with these very sensational headlines and stories, basically accusing Beverly Young Nelson of having forged the signature in her yearbook. Roy Moore also picks up on this, calls her a liar in a lengthy tweet.
Yeah, I'll interrupt you right there. He actually said in his tweet, boyfriend at the time says she lied, employees of the restaurant says she lied, customers of the restaurant says she lied, her stepson says she lied, now she herself admits to lying. Let's count how many national outlets will ignore the fact that she admits to lying. So just wanted to provide our viewers with a little bit of context about what he actually did say to her, about her. Right.
So Roy Moore provided the setup for it, Fox News, Breitbart, and the Gateway Pundit, and I would say in steadily increasing order of ferocity and viciousness and ultimately sloppiness, run with these stories accusing Young Nelson of having forged the signature. What Fox does is about 26 minutes later or so, they kind of change their headline, but they don't change their story. They change their story nearly 2 hours later to clarify actually that she didn't forge anything at all. She just added a couple of things, the aforementioned notes, the date, and the location. However, I haven't checked it this morning, but if you were to go to the Breitbart or Gateway Pundit articles, I would wager that they still have the false claims of forgery in their headlines and their stories.
So let's break it down a little bit, okay? So the idea would be, what would be her claim against Moore? The fact that this might be defamation, because at the end of the day, she really didn't forge anything. All she did was write the name, the date, and location. It's not like she created these fake inscriptions about what he said or anything like that. It's not as nefarious as that. So let's just stick with Moore. What could she sue him for potentially?
So potentially for more, she could sue him for, and we'll get into, I guess, a little bit of legal intricacy. She would be able to sue him fairly easily, I would say, for defamation, general defamation, basically what we would call textbook defamation, because he created a false statement that she lied about the yearbook. He published it to a third party. That would be our second element. There was a level of fault there on his part, at least amounting to negligence. You could go back and forth, and that would probably be where most of the courtroom battles would be held, would be like what level of fault Roy Moore had whenever he sent that tweet calling her a liar. And then what Nelson would have to prove ultimately there would be an injury to herself. That can get a bit nebulous because typically courts are talking about some type of money damages that you are incurring. And that may be a bit more difficult for her to prove against Moore. Moore might not be the guy or the party here who has the most to lose. And the point of the article was that Breitbart, Fox, and Gateway Pundit were the ones that Allred should probably focus on.
So let's talk about them then, and we'll talk about it generally as well. If she goes after these media outlets that said that she was lying, that she forged his forged notes, Fox, you said, retracted it, or at least they changed it. Now, I think that you had said that it remained on their website for maybe an hour and a half, maybe a little over an hour and a half. If the fact they retracted it and was only on there for a short amount of time, aren't they in the clear?
Well, yes and no. As the article states, Alabama actually has a little less strenuous set of defamation laws than most states. Of course, I haven't compared all 50 states to Alabama. But generally, and compared to what most folks learn in law school, Alabama has a fairly lower standard. And they also have like a kind of an interesting push and pull. Because Fox retracted it, that would mitigate any damages that Beverly Nelson would be able to recoup from them. However, another quirk of Alabama's defamation laws is that the defaming party, the party who publishes the false and defamatory statement, has to offer some type of monetary compensation either before or during a lawsuit for the mitigation to fully take effect. So that would clearly suggest some type of fault on Fox News's part. I know they've been paying out a lot of sexual harassment lawsuits over the past decade or so, but I'm not sure they would be ready to go to the purse and pay Beverly Young Nelson. That would be a fairly public black eye for them.
But isn't there a difference between sloppy reporting and intentionally reporting something that you know is false? Isn't there? That's why some of these cases are so tough to win, especially when you talk about public figures. Now, Beverly Nelson's not a public figure, but the idea that defamation is tough to win sometimes in general. So wouldn't you have to show that Fox intentionally knew the facts and kind of misled and printed it anyway?
So you brought up a couple issues there, Jesse. I would say, honestly, for our purposes, Beverly Young Nelson probably put herself into the news media spotlight so much that she might be considered what we call a limited purpose public figure. But that would only be a consideration in a textbook defamation case. In a defamation per se case, which is where a party defames someone by accusing them of a crime, you don't necessarily have to get into all that public-private, or at least the considerations are a little less substantial. And so by accusing Beverly Young Nelson of forgery, which is a crime in Alabama, and honestly every other state.
And it's forgery because, let's break it down, he's a public official? Is that why, in fact, it's a forgery?
Well, no, just the fact that using the word forgery imputes a crime. It's a Class A misdemeanor in the state of Alabama. And typically what forgery has to do with is some alteration of a public document. Because she added notes to something that she personally owned herself, she's clearly not liable for any sort of criminal forgery. So every single outlet that ran with the F word here, forgery, was accusing Beverly Young Nelson of having committed at least the highest misdemeanor type in Alabama.
Right.
And that gets you to what we call defamation per se. Alabama, again, their textbook defamation standards not as strenuous as the rest of the state, and their per se standards are certainly not as strenuous as the rest of the state, rest of the country, and their per se standards make it fairly easy for these type of statements to be actionable, to lead to a lawsuit.
Now, so again, so let's just make sure we get it. So the idea, the fact that they printed something basically denying the truth of the fact that she, claiming that she committed a forgery, the fact that she made up sexual assault charges, that's a real big part of this, correct, Colin? That the fact that they're claiming that she made this story up about her sexual allegations, that's really the crux of it. And if I'm correct, does she have a grounds? Does she have to show, in other words, why these allegations are true? That she would eventually have to show that these sexual allegations, that that Roy Moore did do this?
Well, so here's the thing. With defamation cases, whether it's libel, which is defamation by publication, or slander, which is defamation by a speech act, you basically do most of the fighting before you get to a jury trial. If you can get to a jury trial, the presumption is probably that the defendant is going to lose. So what Roy Moore or what Beverly Young Nelson would or wouldn't have to prove in a jury trial, that gets us very, very speculative. My point in the article is that Beverly Young Nelson certainly has enough to satisfy the legal qualifications to get it away from a judge, for a judge to dismiss all the motions to dismiss, or deny all the motions to dismiss that would certainly be filed by all the parties, and get it in front of a jury. After everything's in front of a jury, I'm not that kind of speculator, but what would or would not have to be proved, certainly. Roy Moore is going to try to prove that, in fact, these things never did happen. He's threatened defamation suits himself. He's not going to file them because that would look terrible for him. I'm not insisting or alleging that any of these things are actually true. I do believe his accusers, but whether there's enough of a legal case for him to be found guilty of these type of things, or at least culpable, liable for them in court, that's a different question.
Right. Doesn't she, Ms. Nelson, doesn't she just want these claims to be investigated by authorities? Isn't that really what she's looking for right now, that she wants authorities, investigators to really look into this matter, even just to show who this man is, or to show her story or what she's been going through? Maybe forget about civil damages or anything like that. She just wants some answers. Yeah.
It's, at least from what I've been able to gather, it's never been about the money for her. That original press conference she had when she came out and accused him of Gloria Allred. This is a woman who you can tell she wants some sort of justice. A lot of her naysayers and detractors were like, well, why did it take you so long for you to bring this up? And she said the truth was, she wasn't ready to see a man like that be elevated to the U.S. Senate, what we refer to as the most storied deliberative body in the history of Western civilization, or something to that effect. It's an important thing to not see people who you feel have victimized you be essentially rewarded for that type of behavior. And that is the sense that I get, is that justice is a very kind of malleable thing. It certainly has legal dimensions, but it also has personal dimensions. And for Beverly Young Nelson, I think, she's not done with it just because he lost his Senate seat. She wants to see him actually be held to account for what she feels are his crimes. Yeah.
So how does this case, whether you want to talk about it from a further investigation into these accounts, or even from a defamation stance, how does this fit into the overall framework of the society we're in today, where every other day, every week, we keep hearing sexual harassment claims, some sort of sexual misconduct claims, whether it's harassment or assault? Really disturbing time. I think it's been now two and a half months since everything happened with Harvey Weinstein and basically burst the bubble on this whole topic. Where does this situation fit into the overall scheme?
The overall scheme, I got to tell you, I wasn't exactly prepared for that question. It's a little broad and far-reaching, but I will do my best. I think there has been a problem in our culture, in our society, in our legal, judicial system for quite some time, where people with, I won't call it unchecked sources of power, but people with enough power have been able to skirt the rules that are supposed to apply to all of us. And it feels like there is some sort of reckoning occurring, you know, far-reaching, broad and wide. And like you said, every other day we hear about another cherished, or maybe sometimes not so cherished, figure either in media, in government, in business, wherever they're from, being accused, probably 9 times out of 10, accurately accused of these horrific crimes. Of course, some are worse than others, but in the broad scheme of things, I think the Roy Moore situation is probably going to be, whoever writes the history about this, one of the major exemplars, or I can take the Latin out, one of the major examples of this reckoning that we've decided that is finally going to happen. As to why it's taken so long, I do have some thoughts and opinions on that, but I don't know. You probably don't have the time, and like I said, I would have had to sketch that answer out a bit more.
Well, it's interesting because later on today we are going to be talking about the latest allegations against Harvey Weinstein, specifically Salma Hayek, and we're also going to be talking about it's just really hard to say, the terrible, terrible allegations in the restaurant industry as well in terms of sexual harassment and misconduct. We'll talk about that as well. But Colin, my last question to you is, you wrote a terrific piece, and anybody who wants to watch it, or read it, you can go on lawandcrime.com. Great editor. What does this say about journalism? The fact that different news outlets, different media outlets are so quick to get that story out. And whether they want it out there or not, and as you said, we're not even sure if Breitbart or the Gateway Pundit has retracted like Fox News has, but the fact to get that story out so quickly for maybe a certain reason, one way or another, what does it say about the level of integrity in journalism?
Well, another question that I could go on for much longer time than you have. Instead, I'll just go ahead and try to bring it all back home and relate it back to the defamation case that I think are still extremely rock solid against Breitbart and the Gateway Pundit, because still no retractions to my knowledge, and probably fairly solid against Fox News. We talk about clickbait a lot and fake news and headlines that oversell the content of the actual articles. These are types of things that are all a big problem. But these 3 media outlets in particular are driven mostly by other considerations. They are movement conservatism to a T. In increasing levels of distillation, you have Fox News a little bit more tepid. Breitbart, they occasionally pretend that they have some sort of stature in the media world. And then the Gateway Pundit really just doesn't care whatsoever. They are doing the things that they are doing because they are on an ideological mission, and they're explicit about it. Now, I'm not saying that every other news outlet is not on an ideological mission. Even the ones who claim to not be on an ideological mission are probably lying, whether they know it or not. But Breitbart, Fox News, and the Gateway Pundit, they all have an agenda. And the agenda with what they did was to sully and tar the name of Beverly Young Nelson. And I think that would be something that she could easily point to and prove in front of a jury for these defamation cases that I am saying, Gloria Allred, file the paperwork. You've got a good shot here.
Colin Kalmbacher, thank you so much for joining us today. And speaking about this Roy Moore issue, again, you can go to lawandcrime.com to read his amazing article that many people are reading. So great job on that article, and thanks again for doing this. You've been great here on to talk about the Roy Moore case, so really appreciate you coming on.
All right, man. Appreciate it, too. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Happy holidays. All right, everybody.